Adriane Lentz-Smith, Associate Professor in the Department of History and a renowned scholar of African American history, 20th century U.S. history, and our national identity in the world. Deondra Rose is an assistant professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy with a secondary appointment in political science. So, Adriane, Deondra, thanks for joining us. I think I will start with a general question, and that is, what brought you to Duke?
Well, I have a short answer and a long answer. I actually first came to Duke as a tipster in 1987. And actually went for 4 straight years, coming from the Atlanta suburbs, coming from a school where I wasn't the only smart black kid, but I was one of the few black kids in advanced courses. TIP offered me a space to realize that the world was full of nerds of all stripes, and that if I hung on for long enough, I'd find my people, and that's how I became an academic.
Wow,
right?
That's incredible.
But then I came back to North Carolina for a postdoc at the University of North Carolina, and ended up connecting with the history department here, got a job in the history department, and had to decide between Smith College and Duke University, and was really struck by the vitality of the intellectual community between the 3, well, more than 3, between the many universities in the Triangle. And the fact that many of the historians who I admired, from John Hope Franklin to Bill Chafe, and the ones that I considered colleagues and mentors, from Tim Tyson to Wesley Hogan, had been in the Duke History Department.
That's fantastic. I visited with some of the TIP students this past summer, and it is incredible to think that one of those students might one day return to Duke on the faculty. It's an extraordinary story.
20 years after I took my first class in Carr.
Yeah.
And the second year I took classes from Gerald Wilson, who most of you have probably also taken.
Deondra?
I mean, for me, it was a question of fit. So when I was finishing up my PhD, I was thinking really seriously about where I wanted to go next as a scholar. And so I knew I wanted to work at a place that really took seriously research and attracted the best and the brightest in terms of students. But I also knew that I wanted to go to a place that enabled faculty to ask really big questions and really difficult questions that had the capacity to help change society. And I didn't necessarily feel that such research would be taken seriously in other departments. And so I remember when I first arrived at the Sanford School during my job interviews, just some of the discussions that I had with some of my now colleagues, I mean, just piqued my interest in a way that was very new and exciting. So I think it really suits me well.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the Duke is, at least when you're faculty, it is, certain high standards, but also a creativity and a sort of encouragement of creativity that kind of allows you to find your voice and your footing as a scholar in ways that fit the profession, but also still feel true to oneself.
Yeah. And I think geography matters too, and I think the fact that all of our schools share the campus, including the medical school, pretty compact, and there is really a strong culture encouraging faculty to get out and around and mix it up with other faculty members. Yeah.
That's right.
Now, you have both studied the development of social policy that grew out of the civil rights movements of the 1960s, and many of these policies were designed to create greater access to higher education for underrepresented groups, for women with Title IX, et cetera. What would you say have been some of the marks of success that stems from those policies, and where do you think we have to go? What ground do we still have to gain?
I mean, so a lot of my work focuses on the policies that were created in the mid-20th century. So after the GI Bill in 1944, lawmakers really moved into the area of providing financial aid on the basis of need. And so for the first time, with the National Defense Education Act, provided women and low-income Americans with pretty extensive support that really helped to move financial need out of the barriers that really restrict access to higher ed. And then we followed up with Title IX, and of course in 1972, and then before that in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act that helped to remove institutional discrimination. And I think those policies have been fantastic in helping to open up access, but I also think that their success is at the root of some of the challenges that we're now facing. So I think that lawmakers and maybe us as a broader society have a really difficult time reimagining what it means to expand true access to higher education. And so we're still wedded to financial need, which of course continues to be an issue with the rising cost of college. But I don't think we're paying enough attention to the pipeline of, like, before students even get to the place of applying for college, like, what are some of the factors that help to determine who's even thinking about higher education? And then once students do, like, how do we define higher education? You know, what do we mean by higher education in terms of quality? I think there's some interesting questions to ask that we just don't.
And who's thinking about higher education? Who's thinking of themselves, imagining it possible for them to go to a place like Duke, right? And this is a place where alums and faculty can do a lot to put into people's heads things that they wouldn't necessarily already have there. Something that they don't see themselves as entitled to in the way that, say, a professor's kid might, or somebody whose family has sort of been in this or through this might. You know, I've studied a lot sort of across the freedom struggle. So my first book, which is on veterans of World War I and the experience in World War I and the way that those people helped build the later movement, is really about a generation of people, if they were college educated, for whom Black colleges and universities were incubators of both community and political consciousness, right? And then there's another story about that integrating generation who gains many things about access and network and resources through integrating, but loses in some ways that sense of, or has to recreate in a new space, a sense of grounding and community and a sort of, and political savvy. And we're in this another period now, I think, where we see that integrating work, we sort of presume it's done, but I hear students saying things. I remember one maybe after the Noose incident a few years ago when we had a town hall where an undergraduate said, I feel like I'm drowning, and people not only don't help me, they tell me I'm not drowning. Right? So I think one of the challenges, or if I think about it in terms of my responsibility to students on campus once they get there, is to help them transform the place, to understand that everybody who comes to an institution is a participant in making that institution theirs and ours, and helping it change a little bit, because that's what we do. We change places by being in them. And everyone there has the right and, in some ways, the responsibility to do that.
Right.
But we need to be conscious of that, and we need them to be conscious of their own part of it.
And it is an opportunity for a place like Duke. We do go to great lengths to recruit a diverse student body. We bring in international students. We represent almost every state in the U.S. In our student body. But it is a bigger challenge to create an environment where every single one of those students, many of whom are just astounded to be at a place like Duke, for them to think of it as their home, right, and to feel that sense of belonging. And as you were saying, for younger children who come from a background where college is just not in the picture for them, to imagine in the first instance that they could do it. We met yesterday, a group of us who are working with the Doing Good in the Neighborhood campaign at Duke. This is a fundraising campaign to generate funds that are then passed along to non-profit groups in Durham, schools in Durham, et cetera. And the principal of Lakewood Elementary School was there. Lakewood Elementary, only about 1.5 miles or so from Duke's campus, is a world away from Duke's campus. And he took some of the funds that he received from Duke to produce a T-shirt for every student and staff member and faculty member in the school. These are Duke blue shirts, I will tell you. But the shirts all say Lakewood University, because he said most of them don't know a university. They don't understand a university. They don't aspire to being part of a university. And I thought it was a very creative way to start with very young kids, building at least that sense of imagination that they could belong. But of course, it's a challenge to do that. And how do you think Duke is doing on that front? In your time at Duke, do you think are we gaining ground? Are we just holding our own? What's your sense of how things are going on campus?
I think that they're going, I don't know, Deondra, you might, we sit in different corners of the campus, so I don't know if we have the same answers, and you seem probably more of a mix of graduate and undergraduate students than I do. I think they're going well. One of the things that's very striking to me about this particular iteration of college student is that these are some of the most active and world-defining students I have ever seen, certainly in my time at Duke. And so their willingness to grab hold, as we know, to tell us when they think there's a problem, right?
They do, they tell me.
But to sort of grab hold of things and try to reshape and tinker and to take what they're learning in the classroom and use it to think critically about the world, I think is more sort of ferocious and in some ways more deft than it's been. I think we're doing it better, they're doing it better. I'm not sure what role I'm playing in it than they have in years, right?
I would echo that. At Stanford, so I've served as co-chair of our diversity and inclusion committee. And so one of the things I've been struck by is the fact that students tend to propel our efforts. And so, the committee started off as being faculty driven. It was all faculty. We sort of came up with the agenda, but then we decided to add some students on. And then it was like the pace, they wanted stuff to happen fast. We actually ended up bringing on a staff member who could help keep the ball rolling down the field when faculty, would get sidetracked by other things like research. But it's interesting because I feel like the students have a really keen sense of some of the really big problems that we're facing in society, and they're really good about gathering tools that will help them to address those problems. And so they're really good about, they want to have tough discussions face-to-face with each other. And, they want to gain the skills necessary to engage in civil political discourse. And so, they'll go out and find a racial equity institute to come in and do a training, and then they'll come to us like, we've got this proposal, we're all ready, we just need you to sign off. It's very professional and it's very impressive. So I have to say the energy and the focus and the commitment to getting things right and getting skills to make Duke better and to make society better is what the students are about.
I will say the one thing that I find is that in their enthusiasm, there's still a role for the me's of the world, so that, I'm teaching the Civil Rights Movement lecture course right now, and I've banned the word oppression because it is a stand-in. I'm like, it is too broad to be analytical, right? Go in for the specifics, tell me what you're talking about, and remember we're talking about 1917 right now, right? So not whatever you've carried in from the Twitters to the space, right? And so that, there's something about sort of honing them. If they're going to do this, whatever they're going to do, I want it actually to have the intellectual heft, right?
That's right.
That if they come out into the world shouting and saying they're from Duke, I want that to mean something, right?
And so in your research, you've studied at different points in time the role that college students played in shaping the civil rights movement. And last year marked the 50th anniversary of the first undergraduate class with African Americans to graduate from Duke in 1967. How do you, from an historical perspective, what role did college students play in the civil rights movement, and does it feel different to you now as you sit here in terms of today's students? And then the second question I have, what does it mean for us to be in the South and to be in this part of the South when we think about higher education today?
It's a small question,
Small
President
question.
Price. So do you, or do you?
So, I mean, so I feel like my thought piggybacks off of, so we typically think oftentimes of the civil rights movement, the mid-1960s, or the period leading up to that. So a lot of my work focuses on basically women's movement into higher education. And one of the interesting things is that higher education was a really important focal point that basically drove women's questioning the status quo and the political strategy that they used to actually grapple with it. And so it was really piggybacking on the legislation that lawmakers created during the 1960s to create Title IX. And it was literally like lawmakers went in and took the language from the 1964 legislation and swapped out the word sex for race, color, nationality. And so I think it was really a process of sort of layering on and building. But also, I mean, the experiences of women, so there were a few women who were in Congress in the 1970s who really spearheaded Title IX. And it was their individual experiences on college campuses that helped to pique their interest. And so I think that's a really interesting, and I could talk ad nauseum about this. So I'll let Adriane.
I could talk ad nauseum about anything. That's probably one of the things that drives people crazy about
That's
me.
why she's a professor.
Exactly, that's the, but, so the civil rights movement has any number of different kinds. It was a multi-generational movement. Labor is a huge part of it. Lawyers are a huge part of it. But if we think about the classical phase, so the post-Brown movement, and the mass movement that we all sort of think of when we think of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, then students are crucial in sort of generational transmission, learning from the elders, mobilizing. We always think about like Freedom Summer, right? 1964, when all of these Northern students go into the South and help register votes, push for the passage of the various acts. And so the sort of energy of students in connecting with local people, learning from local people, expanding the movement into a mass movement, and again, challenging their elders to move a little bit faster than they would be inclined to is central. I think it's important to remember, though, we tend to talk about the contrast between, the good movement then and annoying students now, as if, like, people then were saying, oh, thank God the civil rights movement has come, right? Like, let's do this thing, which is not what was happening at all, right? That, in fact, in HBCUs, as well as in predominantly white universities, students were receiving massive resistance actually is a loaded term, were being resisted by folks who thought that they had gotten ahead of themselves, weren't thinking about the consequences, were endangering their funding, were doing what have you, right? That actually they were having many of the same debates that we are having with them now. And I think it's important both for their humility and ours to keep that in mind. I think the lesson that I would have them learn from that earlier movement is that sort of like sending out a tweet or having like a flash mob gathering is not a movement. It's barely even organizing. And unless you're doing the slow and steady, often frustrating work, which you see very little payoff for in the short term, you're not in it. And so don't do 3 things and give up and say you tried that and it's done. But that's also me turning into a school marm, but
Well, let's turn to some of the questions that I'm reading off the monitor here that came from the floor. What are the greatest threats you see for Duke over the next 15 years and the greatest opportunities for Duke?
I mean, one thing that I'm struck by in the classroom is there are some topics that we're a lot more comfortable engaging with than others. So I feel like race, for example, and other identity-related inequalities are very difficult to really sit down and get into together. And I think that in order to make progress, we have to. And so one thing that I think we'll need to do in order to continue moving forward at Duke with our students, with our staff, with our faculty, in the Durham community and beyond, is to really engage tough discussions like race and to find ways to engage forcefully and rigorously, you know, and you know, in the full, to make full use of our freedom of speech and expression, but then to also engage really respectfully and to know how to bring everybody into the table so that we're all able to engage. So I think there's something about just the discourse that we're having and our capacity to really maximize the quality of that for everybody.
And I can see my answer. I sort of can answer it at the classroom level or in terms of kind of like the national or sort of the broader societal, socio-political level, and then think about the ways that both things impede on this thing that is Duke, that is both, you know, sort of pieces of all of that. And in the classroom, what I see is, again, to sound, again, like I totally do sound like a sort of fuddy-duddy, maybe this is what makes me a historian, but like the need or the desire to have everything happen fast, that knowledge can come fast, that we don't have to read books anymore if we can go and Google Wikipedia and say that you know it as much, you know, that there's a sense that like the old 19th century university, they're acting as if it's irrelevant, when actually the problems that we're having with discourse and listening and dealing in complexity and wrangling with gray is still about learning to read, to seek out an argument, to think about the quality of evidence, and not to think that every assertion should carry equal weight because evidence matters, right? Tied to that on the, again, I get preachy, right? But on the socio-political level, you see this broad rejection of expertise that I think is both confounding and very worrisome, but as a reminder as a historian that actually the embrace of an expert was a historical, there was a moment sometime around the progressive era when people named social problems and thought that there was a professional class of people who should be tasked with solving them. And so I still think that's the case, but remembering to have some historical perspective on it helps me to think about now in ways that are more productive than just cussing.
Right. And even if it's not historical perspective, I think the tendency now is to confuse, you know, a shouting match with discourse. And the problem is that people are very quick to dismiss, not very good at listening, and you evacuate this middle ground that is the space where any kind of reasonable meeting of the minds is going to occur. And coupled with that is this impulse to drive toward various kinds of zero tolerance movements. You know, like this is so important to us that the penalty has to be extreme. And the problem is that if you leap to those kind of extreme outcomes and demand them, then you evacuate all the middle ground where you could do reasonable things that are educational and move a whole community forward. So we have to, in my view, this is the opportunity for universities, places like Duke, and I think we do this well in general, to start modeling more productive kinds of encounters and suspend, you know, to flip Coleridge's phrase, it's the willing suspension of belief, not disbelief. Just suspend our beliefs so that we can at least listen to what people have to say and grant them some degree of humanity and sensibility. Duke feels to me like that kind of a place, but it takes practice. Yeah. And boy, do we need to practice today. So another question here. Does the classroom feel different now than when you were a student? And I take it they're not referring to the physical room in which you teach, but you can interpret it any way you like.
Well, I was a student so recently. Notice that nobody laughed. I can't play that card much anymore. So, you know, I do think that the technology is very different, and I feel it very much in terms of what the students expect from me in the classroom. And so, you know, I'm a political historian, and so my preferred style tends to be, you know, me providing some lecture, asking questions, and I think oftentimes students want a little more of that sort of fast-paced, show us a video clip, show us a documentary, and so I think there's a tension between what I'm offering and what they're expecting at times, and so I think that for me is a major difference.
It doesn't feel as different as you'd think that it might. I mean, I do usually start with a song and spend a lot of time failing to use a PowerPoint, right? So there's but part of it, it's still about going in, expecting them to have read, so we have a shared base of knowledge, me telling them a few things, I heard that laugh, and then making them talk back to me about it. And what's interesting, the difference is that they seem so out of practice in that last part. And I think this is related to changes in secondary education and how those are working. That this sort of like space, like this is not, the content is not the end. That is the basis for the discussion. Remains. I also had students ask me, they're taking a midterm today, and I said, bring your blue books, and they all said, what's a blue book? So.
Yeah. Well, again, it takes practice. In courses I taught, seminar courses, students felt they would read material, but they wouldn't know where to start in terms of speaking. So I took to a practice of giving them in advance 3 or 4 questions and asking them to write 2 pages, no more, no less. Arguing a point in response to one of those questions grounded in the readings. And it made a huge difference because they felt ready to talk. Yeah. Again, these things really do take practice. So we have time for one last question. And this one is, you mentioned that alumni could be the 11th school. How do you think we should be able to engage our alumni in the 11th school? I would say a couple of things myself, and then I'd be curious about your responses. I do think that in no point in history yet has the premium on the ability to learn ever been higher. And that is the groundwork of a liberal arts education. It's adaptability, training you not so much with a body of knowledge, but with tools for learning. And so the question would be, in my mind, at every turn, professionally, socially, as you move from one community to another, and you find the need for learning elevated, my hope would be the first place you would turn is back to Duke. And so the challenge to us is to figure out how we can provide what alumni need at each of those junctures, so that you never leave, there's no need for a reunion because the union was never broken. You don't graduate from Duke, you graduate into this, school of Duke alumni. And a lot of it is just mentorship, and we can lean on peers. This is not so much Duke providing it, but it's the community providing it to each other. And the other big powerful thing is to pull that back into the classroom at Duke. So I think there's tremendous energy there. We actually have a task force working for the next 2 years to help figure out how we can be not just best in class, but unique in class in this respect. So there's a lot of it. Leveraging technology, I think, will be a big piece of it too. But what would you say? How can we best engage alumni and make it essentially an 11th school at Duke? Any ideas?
I mean, I would echo just the value of connecting with alums. I mean, I have to say there have been a number of alums who've come into my classroom, and they offer often, and I definitely readily take them up. So please, anyone who wants to come to a public policy course, please let me know. I feel like the students are oftentimes trying to get a sense of the full menu of options available to themselves or to them after they graduate, and so there's nothing better than hearing from someone who's been in their shoes, who's out changing the world, to really open the realm of possibilities for them. So I think that's extremely valuable.
I think where you began our conversation, which was talking about the pipeline, right? That we can't pull people into Duke as effectively as y'all can, right? And that giving them some sense that Duke, so there's one sort of gigantic, humongous, incredibly tight-knit Duke community, but there's not one Duke. So when people say, oh, I couldn't really imagine applying to Duke, I don't actually like basketball, say, that's fine. We have very good women's soccer, right? Or, you know, we have strong engineering, we have fascinating art. There's, you know, it's actually a good place to do an MFA and sort of experimental documentary. I made that up, but it's something like that in Dutch.
It is a good place, as a matter of fact.
But, you know, so that people have a sense of the capaciousness and the expansiveness and the rich creativity on a number of different fronts of the university. And that's something you're always presenting to the broader public so that they know.
I mean, it's worth reminding ourselves that the university in the first instance was a collection of guilds around libraries, basically. And these degrees, you know, they're basically ranks: bachelor, master, doctor. They're ranks in the guild. So these degrees are not a certificate of completion of anything, but they're essentially a membership card in this guild. And if we think of all of Duke as that kind of a guild, and one that just loves to grow and loves to take in new people and new ideas, all will be right with the world, I would say. So please join me in thanking Deondra and Adriane. Thank you so much.